Good morning and welcome
Hello,
to
this is Samsai again from GamingOnLinux.com, and today I decided to talk to you about Black Mesa, which is a fan remake of the original Half-Life, which has new visuals, completely new models, textures, audio, and brings the game to the newer Source engine instead of the old Gold Source engine. Like I mentioned, it follows the story of Half-Life 2 pretty accurately, and everyone pretty much should know what Half-Life 2, what Half-Life is all about these days. But in case you don't know, you play a scientist called Gordon Freeman during a catastrophe which was caused by a failed experiment at the Black Mesa research facility, and the resulting resonance cascade causes creatures from another dimension to start flooding the research facility, and the US Army soon intervenes, and basically everyone is caught between the crossfire and you just try to survive and fix everything. So Black Mesa replicates the atmosphere and the events of Half-Life quite carefully, but it feels, in general, far superior to the original, just like a remake should. It has like the positives of Half-Life 1, and it improves upon the negatives. So just like Half-Life 1, there are no cutscenes, everything is experienced from the first-person perspective, and you never lose control, except, well, during like one part of the game, but you basically always have control over your character. And because this is a fairly new remake, the graphics actually look fairly decent, I do have to say. And it's probably some of the best fan work I've seen. Obviously this is a commercial game, so, some commercial quality is to be expected, but considering how good Black Mesa looks, particularly if you compare it to, say, Half-Life, like the original, it looks actually pretty damn fantastic. It's actually one of the better looking games in my opinion. And also, the lighting effects have been improved upon quite a bit, and it gives the whole Black Mesa research facility a lot more life, and even in some cases makes the game a little bit more scary. But, of course, because the game has more complex graphics, it means that the requirements are a lot higher than Half-Life 1's. And it has some tendencies to drop frames, even on a fairly recent rig such as mine. So if you are running something a little bit slower, or, around, say, my R7 370, you might have to sometimes, well, with the R7 370 you don't need to drop settings. It manages to keep 60 FPS most of the time, usually it jumps up a lot higher than that. But if you are playing on, say, integrated graphics, then you might have to drop some of your settings. I tried it on my my 810-9600P APU, and that required the settings to be lowered to sort of medium-low, and that kept the frame rate quite well. But the problem with this title is that the frame rates are pretty inconsistent. Some areas run well over 100 FPS, while in other areas the game runs at like 30 FPS. I'm pretty sure there is a CPU bottleneck in there, and with the Ryzen it has actually improved the frame rates a little bit, so areas that used to run at like 30 FPS now run maybe 35 to 40 FPS. So a relatively strong CPU is probably recommended for this game. In addition to these graphical changes, some of the gameplay elements have been modified a little bit. So for example, the crouch jump in original Half-Life doesn't really exist by default. I think you can enable it in the options, but it isn't required in any of the parts of the game. And while basically every single area has been kept in the game, they have sometimes been modified. You can, for example, see it even as early as the tram ride in the very beginning of the game. So the areas have been modified slightly, but they are still recognizable. So if you played Half-Life 1, then you will still recognize the areas. So it hasn't been like totally revamped. The levels still follow more or less the same pattern as they did in Half-Life 1, but they have sometimes been modified a little bit, and I'm pretty sure there are some new like semi-secret areas where you can find some extra loot, and sometimes the game seems to take, different routes to the original. but nothing too excessive. And basically even the sort of annoying environmental puzzles of Half-Life 1 have been kept in the game. So there is a little bit of FPS platforming, which is not necessarily, you know, the greatest thing ever, but, you know, that they are true to the original in that aspect. In addition to those puzzles, some new puzzles have been also added, and they are basically sort of Half-Life 2 style physics puzzles. They aren't nearly as excessive as in Half-Life 2, so you don't really need to do like physics puzzling as much as in Half-Life 2, but there are definitely some physics puzzles in there. They're fairly simple and you won't usually spend too much time messing with the puzzles. Usually it's a case of finding the right thing to place somewhere, and that basically takes care of it. Sometimes you need to destroy some boxes, etc, etc. Fairly simple stuff. The enemies have also received some modifications. The other dimensional creatures are generally a little bit more dangerous than they were in the original. So for example, in Half-Life 1 they were actually fairly simple enemies because they were introduced early and you were expected to deal with them a little bit with a little bit weaker weapons. But in Black Mesa some of them have been buffed quite significantly, so enemies that in Half-Life 1 maybe didn't even pose a threat are actually now a threat, or at least an annoyance. And the normal soldier behavior has not really changed all that much. They still do pretty much what they did in Half-Life 1, so that hasn't changed all that much, at least as far as I'm concerned. They do seem a little bit tactical, a little bit more tactical at times, but they are not like hugely different, so the enemies are pretty much the same when it comes to the human style enemies as they were in Half-Life 1. In terms of weapons, all the weapons from Half-Life are implemented and they are mostly unchanged. Of course the graphical work and audio of those weapons has been modified, and they actually do sound a lot more fun to shoot now, since the guns sound a little bit more punchy than they were in the original Half-Life. Particularly the assault rifle from the original was fairly weak in terms of, actual power and also the sound, and that has been improved upon. Some of the order in which some of these weapons are found has been changed a little bit, however. For example, the revolver, which is a fairly powerful weapon in the game, I think it makes an appearance a lot earlier in Black Mesa than it does in the original. But the weapon balance itself hasn't been changed too much. If you play on medium difficulty, enemies are a bit spongy and they take quite a bit of punishment, so that kinda makes the game, in my opinion, slightly less fun. I mean, I prefer enemies that are strong in terms of damage output, but they die fairly easily to guns. So this game isn't something where you shoot an enemy a couple of times and they die. You do need to fire like half a clip into an enemy before it goes down. And that, in my opinion, is a slightly negative thing, but then again, we're talking about Half-Life here. It's not entirely unlike Half-Life to require a bit of, punch to take down an enemy. And like I said, because the guns sound a lot better and they look a lot better, it's still fun to shoot, and yeah, I don't really have too much to complain about the gunplay here. There are some technical issues regarding this game though, and the game is a little bit crashy. At least on some system configurations, it's really crashy. I even encountered some reproducible crashes while I played this game, and those were solved for me by downloading a beta version which contained a fix that might have made its way into the current build. It's been a while since I last played through this game, because I'm really late with this review. But there have been definitely reports of the game being unstable, and yeah, like combined with the sort of inconsistent performance between the various areas, makes the game a little bit annoying to play on the technical level. So the artistic side and the gameplay side is, in my opinion, very good. I would absolutely recommend that you try this game. But on the technical side, there are some problems. The game has also some rendering issues. It doesn't render all the shadows too well, and sometimes the soldier helmets have very weird coloring. If you want to play this game and you want to avoid as many of those rendering glitches that at least I saw on my rig, which is an R7 370 with the open source drivers, you will want to turn down the shadow quality down from like high to medium, and that avoids at least the helmet bug, which shows the enemies having like weirdly colored helmets. But there are still going to be a couple of graphical glitches here and there. They were usually quite minor though, so I wouldn't worry about the other stuff too much. But at least the helmet bug was pretty annoying to me, so I definitely turned down the shadow settings when I played through the game. And the inconsistent frame rate, it doesn't seem like there is much you can do about it. You can turn down the settings, and I think that might help a little bit, but the minimums when it comes to some areas are pretty damn low. I'm talking like 30 to 35 FPS. And when in some areas the game runs at over 100 FPS, and sometimes it very quickly drops down from like 100 FPS down to 35, and that definitely makes the game a little bit stuttery to play, and sometimes it's a little bit annoying. But in my opinion, it wasn't too bad to stop me from playing it, and the good storytelling and the interesting environments definitely helped me get through that stuff. But it's something you should keep in mind. The game still has some technical issues. It's still early access. Oh, and by the way, talking about the story, there is one part of the game that is still missing, and that's the final area, the Zen. That hasn't been implemented in Black Mesa quite yet. They're still working on that. So if you want the fullest experience of Half-Life, you are still probably better off playing with Half-Life Source or just the original Half-Life. But as far as I'm concerned, it was still well worth it to play Black Mesa with, without the Zen quite yet implemented. And I have actually spent 16 hours playing that game, which is fairly decent. Of course, there has been some replaying because I had to record some video and stuff like that. So the base game probably takes around maybe 12-ish or a little bit more than that hours, depending of course on your skill level. But if you want to see Zen, that is not quite yet in the game. Though some people have claimed that Zen is not actually as fun as as the other areas. So for some people, that might not matter as much. But the story that is already in there is actually fairly complete, and in my opinion, it's already worth it to go for this over Half-Life 1. Of course, provided that you can run this with your hardware and you don't encounter too many crashes. For me, the game was fairly stable with the open source drivers, and it was only that one area where the game kept crashing because I destroyed some sort of a tanker, and that caused the whole game to crash due to all the physics objects flying around. That might now be patched. If it isn't, there is a beta that fixes that problem. So if you encounter a crash that keeps happening again and again, you can go to the betas, and I believe that you can find the beta there, and that maybe takes care of it. Unless it's entirely possible you might not even see the problem if they have implemented that fix into the main build already. But yes, overall, it's a very good remake. It's basically exactly what a remake should do. It makes the game look better, it makes the game play better, it overall makes the game a better experience. And I do wish we could see more of these kinds of remakes of older games, where they basically bring up the graphics, fix some of the gameplay issues, and basically get a better product out of it, because even games as old as Half-Life still deserve to be played in some way these days. Anyway, that's it for me and for Black Mesa for now. I do recommend it. Get it, particularly if it's on sale, get it, and at least monitor the sort of how Black Mesa develops. But I would definitely recommend that you play it. In my opinion, it was a very fantastic experience, and I do recommend it. So anyway, that's it for me, and we will see in future live streams and videos.